Hi everybody, my name is Erica. Thank you for being my audience for my presentation today about audiences of all things. I wanted to kick us off by telling a little story about a time that I was in an audience and it was a unique experience. Last year I had the opportunity to attend the Push Festival of Performing Arts. A friend of mine said he wanted to go see this show called Alice in Glitterland. So of course, it's been on Alice in Wonderland, as you would imagine. We arrive at the venue, and as we are getting ready to go into the theater, an assistant approaches me with a mask and says, "We'd like you to wear this mask. By wearing it, you are saying that you are giving your consent to be touched and spoken to in this performance, but you will have the opportunity to withdraw consent whenever you like." So at this point, like, I'm already here. I'm not gonna turn back just because of a little mysterious touching that could happen. So, okay, sure, I'll put on the mask. So we put the mask on, and when we go in, there is a performer who kind of gives us the rules of the show. He says, "You're about to go into this fairy court, and the fae are sensitive creatures, so you must never talk to them." And he did give us a safe word, so if we ever were not comfortable with what was happening, we would just say the safe word and it would stop, and he assured us of that. So the rules of engagement were kind of set up there. We go into the hall, and the delivery of the story is asynchronous. There's scenes happening all the time. On the stage, there was a tea party. In this one corner, there was a pole dance. In this other corner, there's a couple dancing, and then that couple's having a fight. And all of these things are kind of swirling around you, and you, as the audience member, you can walk up to those different performances that are happening, micro performances that are part of this greater whole, and they're constantly changing. While this is happening, the performers not involved in the scenes that are currently taking place would come and find individuals in the audience and pull them aside. So I had two one-on-one interactions in this performance. I had the Red Queen, who pulled me aside and told me a story about how in love she was, and she asked me, have you ever felt this way before? And she went on this monologue in this very private little cubby of a room that they had made. And I, of course, remained silent because those were the rules of engagement, and tried to respond to her with just my facial expressions. I also was offered tea by the Mad Hatter, so the Mad Hatter poured tea for me and told me a story. And there were all sorts of moments like this that just had little sparks of engagement. I should also note there was a ball pit, and everyone was allowed in the ball pit, so obviously I went in the ball pit. You would have too. Definitely walked away from the experience feeling like I had a real role in it, that I got to choose the experience that I had, and that how I responded to things made a difference on what kind of play it was that I saw. A major part of the performance for me was the conversations that happened after, when I sat down with my friends and we talked about what kind of one-on-one interactions did you have, and what I noticed you were up on the stage while I was watching the dance. What was happening at the tea party? What did they say? And by having those conversations, we were able to piece together all of the different parts of the story. I think some people wouldn't enjoy this experience because they become hyper aware of their body, because they feel embarrassed or like they don't know what to do or how to engage. But by the same token, these types of performances draw crowds because there's a sense of adventure and playfulness, and they're kind of a puzzle that you get to unpack. So they're also very fun. In this presentation, I'll be talking about how this type of participation actually happens in all live performances, that the audience is always part of building the story and about how the entire performance event comes together. And on that note, let's get right into it.
Walmsley argues that the primary role of the audience is to provide resonance and meaning. So we're creating stories for them, and in a way, they define who we are as tellers. Our goal is to hook them and hold them and tell around them. And in so doing, there are countless considerations we make. We might ask ourselves, how old are they? Do they have special needs? Who are they to you in relation? Are they coworkers? And how much of your tale is being shaped around your personal biases and assumptions about who they are and what they want. This section will start with what some experts say about audiences. Clearly, this is something that as tellers, we can only truly learn to read audiences with experience. But as beginners, we can look to the experts and begin to understand who is in our audience and how we can tailor to them. Context is important with your audience. Keystone notes that participants assume social identities as tellers and as listeners. So when we're sitting at the kitchen table, stories flow back and forth, but when we're on a platform, tellers stand on a stage and are divided from listeners who silently observe. Of course, there's everything else in between. Hollingworth notes the formal roles of audiences. Every audience is unique, however, they share certain properties. So I will share the chapter from his book, The Psychology of the Audience, in my resources if you'd like more information. But basically, he says that the performer should classify their audience and consider their orientation towards them. And why is your audience here? What do I need to do to adapt to them? And I think this is something we should take with us to all different streams of storytelling. This is something we can take with us to education, theater, business, family stories, oral tradition, therapeutic telling, and clearly learning to read the audience is something that is developed with experience, but perhaps these types can give beginners a little bit of a starting point on how we think about our audiences. The pedestrian audience might be a busy street or an intersection, but basically individuals are going about their business, and you as the teller must win over the audience. In the discussion group or the passive audience, the teller and the audience are highly polarized to each other. They might be in an auditorium, like at a lecture. In these environments, the audience members become very aware of themselves. It's a very formal environment, and they're picking up on cues from each other, but they usually ease into a state that is more restful than alert. So initial attention is guaranteed because they were all gathered on purpose, but Hollingworth argues the maintenance of interest is the goal with this type of audience. The selected audience has been put together, like a jury, for example. They're assembled for a common purpose, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're sympathetic with the teller or with each other. The speaker should focus on impression, persuasion, and direction. Your goal is to be impressive. The concerted audience is assembled with a shared purpose and mutual interest, but no clear roles or rigidity. So an example might be a graduate seminar. The main task is convincing and directing action or thought. The organized audience has a rigid division of labor and authority with specific common purpose. So example, a team in a company or a military unit. Your goal in this case is to issue instructions. Attention, interest, impression, and conviction are often assumed in this circumstance. The absent audience is a group of individuals who observe at different times without any congregation. It is inherently different because it's not social. The individuals are influenced by a common stimulus, but not by each other. So this is clearly something that's becoming a lot more common in the digital world. The key to Hollingworth's roles is considering how polarized the audience and the performer are from each other. It's about considering what their expectations and goals are as individuals coming into the interaction so that you can best play to those strengths. The speaker, he stresses, should take on individuals in the crowd. By addressing the crowd as a whole, you end up sounding automatic. But by considering all of the individual people who are there, we can perform a truly authentic experience with our audience. Makowitz takes on a different approach, identifying only two types of audiences, the accidental and the integral. To summarize shortly, in their words, an accidental audience is present to see the show, while the integral audience is necessary to accomplish the work of the show. So the integral audience, for instance, might indicate a ritual. The audience behaves differently between the two types, and in general, the accidental audience pays closer attention. This is because they chose to attend the event, and it's easier to have that more intimate connection because the crowd is going to be smaller by nature. Also, the integral audience already knows what's happening, so they can kind of ease off. And the integral performance is often so long, it's impossible to sustain attention throughout the whole story. So accidental audiences fit convenient time frames, and ritual audiences manifest devotion. At an oral storytelling event in Slovenia, a researcher noted 6 main roles that audience members tend to take on, that they performed these behaviors repeatedly. The motivator is there are 2 types. Type A is not familiar with the material and tries to stimulate storytelling associations. So for instance, the researcher asking, what kind of story can you tell us about? Type B knows the repertoire and will say something like, oh, tell us the story about blank. The assistant will help recall key details during the telling. The inquirer will ask questions or for explanations. The yaysayer or naysayer will interrupt the story to comment on its veracity, saying if something's true or not, or making minor corrections. The complementer will intervene with additional facts that they believe the teller missed. The commentator, either during or after the story, will make remarks about the nature of the story, and this can also include nonverbal reactions like laughing or whistling. And some of these roles, so for instance, the motivator type B, assistant, yaysayer, naysayer, and complementer, the researcher points out mean that the story was already told and heard and alive in oral tradition because they indicated that the audience was so intimately familiar with it. This is something, looking at these roles, we need to consider that these are only one sample from a very specific cultural and individual context, a specific event, but I think we should look at them and think about them on how they reveal how the audience can become involved even in a tradition that is not marked for its participative roles. Live performance is unique because of the relationships that are formed and the nature of the audience and the teller as co-creators. In the building of this relationship, we should consider the size of our audience. Marie Shedlock, an expert storyteller, believes so strongly in what she calls the miniature character of the story that artistic presentation is lost in telling to large audiences. Speaking of her presentation to an audience 5,000 strong, she says, quote, though the dramatic reaction upon oneself from the response of so large an audience was both gratifying and stimulating, I was forced to sacrifice the delicacy of the story and to take from its artistic value by the necessity of emphasis in order to be heard by all present. One last consideration is the familiarity with the story that the teller has. Storyteller Eileen Caldwell considers books a barrier to the intimate relationship with the audience that the storyteller should have. By knowing stories inside and out, tellers can focus on the social nature of the oral storytelling event during the performance. In short, we should be mindful to the barriers that exist when forging the connection between the audience and the teller. Subjectivity has a huge role in the building of the relationship between the teller and the audience. Kay Stone says, the first audiences for performed stories are the tellers themselves. In other words, we have our own associations to characters and feelings about the story in line with our own life experiences and cultural background. Every teller is an audience first, and the teller's perceptions of the stories are ever changing. How an individual responds to an audience reaction is also very individualized. Hollingworth says, quote, the apathetic and inert audience that chills the zeal of one speaker will fire another with strenuous determination to get a rise out of them before it is over. The unfriendly or belligerent audience that intimidates one will excite another to a heightened aggressiveness. The responsive and applauding audience that strikes new sparks in the mind of one speaker may provoke another to relax his effort and to resort to easy expedients and cheap ideas, end quote. Cultural subjectivity is, of course, an enormous consideration. In the Hawaiian mo'olelo tradition, the teller will richly and poetically describe places. To Western audiences, this might be boring, but to the Hawaiian audience, this is proof that the truth of their story means they've actually been to that place, and it speaks to the teller's memory. This is something they expect, almost like a travel guide. These Hawaiian stories are also an example of how translation may inhibit the audience from receiving the teller's original intent. The translation process can lose a lot of the poetry, where fish and dolphin no longer rhyme in English, and the native language was actually an important cultural element in the telling of the story to begin with. Cross-cultural storytelling can be a bridge between our subjective experiences, but it is also important to acknowledge that who we are as tellers and who we are as an audience are going to be affected by our personal and cultural experiences. This should prompt us to constantly reevaluate how our own subjective experiences and those of our audiences could be influencing how the tale is told and received. Let's take a moment to talk about the action of being an audience member. What are audience members doing, and what are they getting out of a live storytelling event? Critics observe that the active role of the audience has been undervalued in the past, treated like the audience is a homogenous mass rather than as the actual dynamic force that they are that add crucial meaning to performances. Audiencing is a new word borrowed from cultural studies and deployed in performance studies that describes the work of the spectator. It, quote, describes acts of attention, of effect, of meaning making, of memory, of community. A focus on audiencing recognizes that attention is a constructive or performative act, that spectators bring performance into being through the nature of their variously active, distractive, or contested attention, end quote. I want you to take a moment to think about what you do when you are audiencing. I personally become a version of myself who's maybe more vocal or easier to laugh. Um, I realize I have an awareness that the performer needs me and that the performance will be easier and better for everyone if they can hear my enjoyment and if they can see my level of attention and engagement. So please think about that. That's something I'd really like you to respond to in the discussion. Performances are an extremely empathic activity. According to Walmsley, they invoke 3 different levels of empathy in addition to different modes. So part of the experience that we have when we're audiencing is experiencing the emotions of the characters in the story along with them. There is always a chance that fellow audience members will negatively impact the experience by making noise or disruptions. However, the experience of laughing and crying along with each other creates a sense of connection between members of the audience. The experience of empathy we have to the performer or performers along with fellow audience members becomes an emotional contagion that has tremendous power to restore collective energy, collectively restructure identity, and create a sense of community. We catch emotions from each other, and it can enhance the experience greatly. The emotions of amazement through to catharsis we experience together make the performance a, quote, multi-sensory cultural experience rather than a creative product. Theoretical definitions of engagement rotate around the idea that it is a psychological process that seeks to create meaningful relationships with audiences via interactive and immersive experiences, which frees audiences and forges connections by inviting audiences into the process of making art. It is, in a way, both a psychological manipulation and a sociocultural benefit. There's evidence that the primary reason people come to performance events in the first place is to become engaged. It is emotional and participatory. And speaking from my own experiences, I agree and believe this is why we still value live performances, even in an age where entertainment is constantly at our fingertips at home. As shared experiences, they're more fulfilling. They are an exercise in meaning making, not just entertainment. Through the act of audiencing and engagement, we seek aesthetic and spiritual enrichment. The impact an audience can have on a teller spans far outside of individual storytelling events. In her book, Burning Brightly: New Light on Old Tales Told Today, Kay Stone talks extensively about how audiences have changed her stories and her role as a teller. She discusses how, for specific audiences, altered her telling of The Curious Girl, a Grimm fairy tale. The phrase burning brightly repeats a few times in the story, and it's also the last story told in the book, so I get the impression this is an especially important story to the author. I've included it in the resources, and I highly recommend you take a moment to pause and read it now. The story's much better told in her own words, which you can read on the ebook through the University of Alberta Library. However, here is a brief summary of how the story evolved with each of Kay's tellings. In the beginning, she would tell the story of the curious girl with 4 animal forms that were supposed to represent 4 different elements, and this was very elaborate and at the center of the story. And one time when she was telling this to her friend's daughter, the 9-year-old girl asked, "Well, why does the girl have to turn into all of those animals?" The teller realized at that point that they were becoming too unwieldy and literal, almost slapstick in her words. And she rephrased the question in her head as, why do adults make things complicated? Those elements didn't need to be described explicitly, and they became more clear after she reshaped the story with implied elements. A major change happened the next year when she was telling the story to an audience of adults at a folk music concert. When she was reaching the end of the story, right before she spoke the final words, the audience started applauding. The final words are the witch acknowledging that she didn't know the story the curious girl had told and releases her from her bird form. But instead, the audience responded to the moment when the curious girl says the first words of her own story. So the story ends as it begins, and this adult audience saw the poetry in that and responded to it. So at first, even though the teller thought they might be trying to hurry her off the stage, it was actually that they saw the poetry in the telling and helped her realize it. The next change happened when she was presenting a panel for the American Folklore Society on the topic of women in power, and speaking to an audience mostly comprised of women and of academics. She came to make realizations about who the witch was and some more in-depth information about the character. And the story changed again when a 10-year-old boy who had heard her tell the story told it back at a casual gathering of storytellers. Originally, the girl in the story had her shape returned to her before she searched the world for stories, which Kay realized after didn't really motivate her to return to the witch and get her true form back, something that she hadn't realized in the original version of the story. But when this boy told it, he had the witch, rather than the girl, transform her, and he had her keep her bird shape as she traveled through the world collecting stories. So even though her initial response was to correct him on this version of the telling, she realized that this actually was a really effective change. It's not just the story that evolves. The teller, too, comes away changed with each cumulative experience of telling. Stone describes how she had told a story so many times that it became increasingly emotional to tell with each performance. After having told the story to her young son while bathing him, to a couple celebrating their anniversary, to a room full of emotional parents, and to newlyweds at a wedding reception, she began to cry more with each telling, since all of those people became part of the experience and therefore part of the story. She ceased being able to tell the story casually, and she would have to attune herself to her listeners before she could. They might not be in the mood for a serious tale or ready for this impactful story. She had to learn to be careful for others as well as herself, since it moved her so much to tell it. As discussed earlier, all live audiences have a participatory role. They all perform the act of audiencing. However, there are some types of audience participation that are more participatory than others. The definition we'll be using is the participation of an audience or an audience member in the action of a performance. And it feels different because it is different. This type of audience engagement requires the teller to relinquish some of their control. In theater, there are countless participatory genres. In the oral tradition, contemporary storytellers make two distinctions. Leaning back or hypnotic storytelling asks the audience to go into like a trance-like state, to be completely absorbed in the story, whereas leaning forward or participatory selling actively engages the audience and asks them to make outward responses. And those responses might appear as like a question and answer format, back channeling, exclamations, or the teller might actually request for gestures, vocalizations, or songs. By telling a participation story, it allows audience members to directly engage in establishing narrativity. The teller can weave audience responses into the story, making the interaction a co-creation rather than a recitation. Narrativity and creativity become shared, and the teller and the audience must work together in order to progress through the story. Makiewicz believes that the audience's role as co-creator allows the audience to enter a headspace of characters and speak the message instead of merely hearing it. The protagonist assumes a different shape, taking on the real-life experiences of the participants. In their words, quote, "The shared dramatic experience results in the viewer's creation of a separate personal drama by sharing the play with the performer rather than his conforming to the protagonist on stage. Thus, one may be tempted to assume that the viewer becomes the protagonist." Although there are benefits to audience participation in storytelling, it is not without its controversy. In the participatory theater genres, there are a few things more despised. Maybe this is an exaggeration, but there is definitely a great deal of skepticism about the kind of excessively avant-garde types of participatory theater. And often only real thespians like to be the people who go and participate in those genres. Some people feel anxious about the prospect of getting involved. My partner is one of those individuals who balks at the idea of having to speak to a performer. At one event, a magician approached him in front of the whole audience and asked him, "Sir, do you have your wallet on you?" To which he flatly, immediately replied, "No." Which of course he did, but he did have his wallet on him, and this was just a declining of the invitation. But there was this awkward moment where the magician had to reorient, and my partner still feels so much anxiety about the awkwardness of that invitation and that interaction, and his dislike of that involvement is so great that he won't come see magicians with me anymore. Although it's controversial for adults, participative storytelling is alive and well in the educational storytelling stream, where in the Western tradition, at least, there is a great deal of audience participation for juvenile groups. Despite some controversy in the Western world, audience participation remains an important part in many world storytelling traditions. I could not possibly begin to cover all of the many types of storytelling that exist in different cultures. However, I would like to take just a moment to touch on expected audience roles and behaviors from a few international examples. I'd like to note that there's a great deal of subtlety, complexity, and adaptability that spans culture. Stories may be adapted for their listeners. For example, a Cree performer adapted his material to his audience by ending his story by talking about how beards fit into the myth, which was his way of acknowledging a non-Indigenous member of his audience who had a beard and welcoming an outsider into a traditional Cree story. This is a common feature in storytelling. On the other side of the planet, an ethnographer describes how a Bemba storyteller in Africa tailored her story to suit her presumed Catholic audience because he was white, by telling a religiously important story, and paused for long periods to get reactions or comments from either the anthropologist himself or from other audience members. In contrast to this, there are some traditions that rely heavily on rigid roles and expectations. For example, in Jewish Passover celebration, a ritual known as Seder includes 4 questions that must be asked by the youngest child present in order to begin the telling of Exodus. Audiences play a special role in the telling of Ga folktales in sub-Saharan Africa. The session opens with an open period where everyone gets to tell riddles. The teller sits in the center of a circle or at the opening of a horseshoe, and like in the crick-crack tradition we've already learned about, there are traditional calls and responses. They ask the audience, "Shall I narrate to you or shall I not?" And the audience responds in unison, "We are listening," or "Narrate to us." This establishes rapport and makes sure that everyone is paying attention. The spectator participants use speech, cultural crafts, improvisation, humor, and call and response. So the teller includes the audience in the action of the story. They might do this by directing remarks at a specific person or cause them to react to dramatic or humorous moments. The narrator and the audience may sing together. Though some features remain fixed, the narrator remains open to guidance on the plot as the audience condemns or applauds the teller during the telling. The session ends with a playful chanting of the closing formula, "Cockroach, get off of my ears." The last example I'd like to share with you, and I apologize to any Indonesians who might be cringing at my pronunciation, is the Dendeng Pua tradition from Western Sumatra. There are about 12 stories, and they are generally about the changing fortunes of regular people, usually about their relationships and usually for the worse. It's sung by 1 or 2 people and accompanied by a flute. It occurs at traditional celebrations, but it does also come up in elements of modern life. The singer traditionally begins by making respectful comments about their guests and about their host. Some of the listeners might not pay complete attention, but those who do are especially responsive. This may be in part because the singer often addresses certain members of the audience by their names. Audience members shout during gaps in the song because they are, quote, egged on by 1 or more aficionados known as red dragonflies who are afterwards rewarded by the singer for a small sum of money.
Audience types and the roles audience members take on, the traditions we indulge in from the most formal to the kitchen table, all of these are different ways that the audience and the storyteller build an intimate connection together that changes them both. Thank you so much to you, my audience, for joining me on this journey, and I can't wait to hear about your experiences in the discussion this week. And of course, thank you to my live audience, seen here chewing on my computer wires. And the audience build an intimate connection.